lovelies, and welcome back to my channel. I'm Heather, and this is the Happenings with H.A.P. H.A.P. meaning my initials. So October is sadly over. Tear. It went by really way too fast. I did manage to read nearly every single book that was on my TBR for October. So I had a whole plethora of spooky reads in October, and I'm super excited to share my wrap up with all of you because it was a lot. There was a lot of spookiness. Pretty much all the books were really good, so I know myself very well. It's definitely a great reading month, and I definitely got freaked out a couple times, and I am here for that. As always, thank you so much for subscribing to my channel. If you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button down below. Hit the notification bell so you know when new content is coming out, as well as like, dislike, comment, do whatever you like to do. Visit my social medias. I'm just shilling everywhere, but you know, we gotta get it out of the way early. So now on to my spooky October reading wrap up. First up, we have The Turn of the Screw by Henry James. As I mentioned in my October TBR, I specifically wanted to read this one, A, because I hadn't read it and it's a classic, B, to prep and read the source material for what the Netflix Haunting of Bly Manor was based on. For those that don't know, this book is basically a story within a story. It's at this gentleman's club, and this man named Douglas starts talking about someone who had died that was a governess to him when he was young, and that by the sound of it, he had kind of a crush on her, but she had written a letter about her experiences as a governess in a previous estate. And so the beginning part of the novel is him essentially telling the story of this woman's experiences in Bly Manor. So we follow the governess who ends up getting this job to take care of this man's niece and nephew in this far off estate, Bly Manor. And what's really interesting is that they are I believe his brother's children, but their parents have now died, and he just basically doesn't want anything to do with them. And like the caveat to her taking over and why it's such a great paying gig is that when she's there, he doesn't want to know anything about anything. He doesn't want any questions about anything, be contacted for any reason, like unless it's absolutely these children are literally at death's door. She takes the gig and she gets on really well with the little girl Flora, and the older boy Miles actually ends up coming back home for summer from school. What was really interesting, because this was a book written in the 19th century, the relationship between Miles and the governess is odd. She describes like kind of how handsome he is, how sweet he is, and her affections for him, and it's very much obviously reciprocated by him. He's like a model little child, they both kind of are, but it's just the way she dotes on him and the way she describes him is just very odd. And I don't know if that was just a 19th century convention based on boys having more worth than girls, but it was just weird, and it made me a little uncomfortable sometimes, not even gonna lie. And I don't know if it was supposed to feel weird or that's just my 21st century brain thinking that it's weird, but yeah, it was just something that I noticed. It was like an extra layer of oddities added to it. Things seem to be going well for the most part. She gets along with the staff. Mrs. Gross is the housekeeper. She gets along with her really great. And Mrs. Gross kind of gives her tidbits about what happened to Miss Jessel, the previous governess that tragically died in the lake by the manor. During her stay, the governess starts to notice this man and woman appearing throughout the grounds, and she's very confused by it. But she's starting to deduce that it must be Miss Jessel and Peter Quint, who apparently had a bit of a relationship. Peter Quint is assumed to have died, but he may have also ran away because he did steal a sum of money from the uncle, the owner of Bly Manor. She's starting to become convinced that the children see these figures as well, and they're just not telling her. It's basically a study in kind of paranoia, because even through to the end, you're not 100% sure whether what she's seeing is real or not, whether the children are lying to her or not, and whether she's basically going insane. That's really what makes the novella so famous and kind of a touchstone of 19th century Gothic horror, is because it's very much not explicitly stated what is and isn't real, so it's left to the reader's interpretation of what actually went down. It wasn't my favorite book that I've read. I only gave it 3 stars, and that's just because it's 19th century writing, which can be a little bit flourishy, but I liked the basic idea of the book, but there was definitely parts of it that just kind of dragged just because of the flowery language. So it's kind of, I feel bad giving it such a low rating, but you can't love them all. I definitely have a lot of 5-star classics on my shelf that I absolutely adore. This just wasn't one of them, but I did really enjoy it, and atmospherically it was wonderful, and it definitely set me up for the spooky season for sure. Now we're going to get into the Stephen King reads that I read this month, because as I had said, I wanted to read as many Stephen King novels as I could because I'm trying ever so slowly to get through his catalog. The first Stephen King book that I read was Pet Sematary. I don't think I've ever seen the movie. If I did, I probably was a really small child and don't really remember it because it definitely came out in the 80s. I made sure to go into this knowing really nothing except that it's about a pet cemetery, and I assumed based on all the covers that a cat came back to life somehow. Also, the parodies from South Park were something that I also knew about, and I knew their origins were from Pet Sematary. So I had some inkling of what it was about. And I did the audiobook, which was narrated by Michael C. Hall of Dexter fame. It was a very fine choice for the audiobook. He did an amazing job doing all the accents, especially for Judd Crandall, who, as I said, from all the parodies, has a very distinct Maine accent voice. Yeah. I can't believe I just did that on camera. It was a really great audiobook. And what's really cool is that there was a author's note in the beginning, and it told the story of how Stephen King thought up this novel. And a lot of the events in the book were events that actually almost happened to him. And this book is basically just a what if situation of like, what if the worst thing that could ever happen would happen? And at least in that author's note, he considers it one of his scariest novels just because of the personal experiences he has attached to it. The book follows the Creed family, Lewis Creed, Rachel Creed, their daughter Ellie, their son Gage, and their cat Church. And they all moved from Chicago to Maine because Lewis gets a pretty stable, decently well-paying job at the University of Maine as the head doctor for the health center there. So they move into the small town of Ludlow, and like all Stephen King books, there are little tidbits of mentions from his other novels because it all exists in the same universe, for those that don't know. They have really great across-the-street neighbors, Judd and his wife, and it's basically like a new start for the family and just a way to kind of get away from the city but still have each other, and you know, the American dream type of archetype in rural Maine. They have a lot of acreage, and they actually live next to these Ludlow woods, which I believe the day they move in or the day after, their across the street neighbor Judd takes them to the back of the woods behind their house where there is this very old, very large pet cemetery. Rachel, obviously being the mother in a horror novel, thinks that's weird and creepy. Lewis kind of finds it weird. They think it's a kind of this quirky little thing that is just present in their backyard. Whatever. Judd and Lewis end up hanging out a lot because what else is there to do really in rural Maine? And Judd ends up telling him a bit about the history of the town as well as the history of the pet cemetery. There is this subplot of this very strong tension between Rachel's parents and Lewis because Rachel essentially worked to put him through med school and her parents were rich, so there's this kind of class money dynamic that they have issues with. When Rachel wants to take the kids back to Chicago for Thanksgiving, he tells her to just go by themselves and that he will stay and just chill out at home for Thanksgiving. He ends up actually having Thanksgiving with Judd. Unfortunately, the house that they live on is right next to extremely busy strip of the highway, like an offshoot of the highway where trucks go barreling down. By the descriptions of it, it's basically like having, one lane freeway like right in front of your house. And Judd had warned him, be careful of your kids and your pets because a lot have been lost to that road. Of course, as fate would have it, Church, his daughter Ellie's dear cat, is ran over and killed by a truck or something and ends up on Judd's property. And for some odd reason, Judd decides to take Lewis and the cat to an offshoot of the pet cemetery that is considered the real pet cemetery, that is supposed to be an ancient burial ground from the Mi'kmaq tribe, and they bury Church there, and Church ends up actually coming back the next day, but not quite right. I'm not going to go into the rest of the plot, but as you can imagine, in situations like this, things definitely go awry, and the pull of this pet cemetery causes Lewis to kind of go a little insane and cause even more problems for his family. I will say that this novel was a bit unexpected in its format because obviously with marketing for the most recent film that came out as well as the original, it very much focuses on the animals coming back, other things coming back, but The bulk of this novel is really dealing with Lewis trying to keep his family together and trying to talk himself out of making terrible decisions that down the line he knows he's going to make. Not a lot of like true horror happens in the typical, zombie people type of situation. It's much more spread out than that, and it's much more nuanced than that, and I really wasn't expecting that going into it, but I really enjoyed that aspect of the novel, that it wasn't very straightforward. Like even The Shining is rather straightforward, even though it does deal with family dynamics as well. This book deals with class dynamics, obviously because it is written by a man for a man's point of view. It does deal with the relationship of man to his own family. That's one thing I love about Stephen King, is that sometimes things he writes are a bit more on the surface, a bit more on the nose, but other times he does get into these nuances of just life. And this is one of those books. It was definitely creepy. It had creepy atmosphere, but it wasn't very much like a horror novel in the traditional sense. And I think that's what was really great about it. A deeper type of terror than just straight up, horror in that sense. I really enjoyed it. I'm glad I read it since it is, a classic of his canon. And I give this one a 4 stars and definitely recommend. The next Stephen King novel that I read was The Long Walk. And this one was actually released originally in 79 under a pseudonym of Stephen King's, Richard Bachman. In the author's note in the beginning, he actually kind of goes into the Richard Bachman persona and how that pseudonym, let him write things that were a bit more bleak than the type of writings that he has become a bit more accustomed to. I will agree with that assessment, Mr. King, because this was extremely bleak, extremely anxiety inducing in a way I kind of suspected it would be, but kind of didn't. It's labeled as a dystopian, but I didn't really get full dystopian vibes because what little we know about the US at the time that exists in this book, it doesn't honestly seem that dissimilar than the US of now. I don't really want to say now because the US of now is a little different, but we're not going to get into that in this video. But, modern day US, there doesn't seem to be any abject poverty. People have normal jobs, relatively normal lives. The premise of the novel is very straightforward. There is this contest in the first day of May called The Long Walk, and 100 boys have to basically go through a physical psychological evaluation before they are then selected from a pool of boys. I believe it might be 2 from each state, and once they're picked, then they have to go up to basically the Maine Canada border, and the rules of this contest are that the boys must walk nonstop from the border of Canada, Maine, all along the eastern US. This is through rain, shine. They aren't allowed to sleep. They aren't allowed to stop. They can only have 30 seconds before they are given a warning. After 3 warnings, they get a ticket, which is when they unfortunately are killed. And the last boy left walking is the winner and basically gets whatever he wants for the rest of his life. Even reading this basic premise, you don't really understand until you read it, like the ramifications of that, which is just the fatigue of these boys and essentially knowing that once they start this, they can't stop it and only one of them is going to live no matter what. Unlike the Hunger Games, which is probably the most closely related thing most people will think of when they think of this, they are randomly drafted into it based on their age. In this novel, they volunteer to do this. So this isn't something that someone forces upon them. They volunteer because it sounds like a great prize and they're younger boys. So between probably like 15, 16 to like 19, which are usually, in the peak of physical condition pretty much. But the actual realities of walking at I think it's supposed to be 4 miles an hour nonstop, even going to the bathroom, if it takes you too long, you will get ticketed. And if I remember correctly, every hour you walk, if you have a warning, it drops off. So essentially you can get yourself up to the edge, but then you have to basically keep walking it off. The story follows Raymond Garrity, who is one of the contestants from Maine, and basically all the boys that he befriends, if you can even call it that, along the way. And we learn a bit about these other boys' life stories, their motivations for joining this, and it's extremely bleak because King does describe the physical and mental taxation that this type of an event would do to a body, and you essentially are just reading this wondering at who's going to die next, and it's just this kind of anxiety that I had with it the whole time because only one person's gonna win because that's literally it. The game does not change no matter what, and you don't know who, and you don't know why someone might be killed because they either mentally just can't take it anymore, physically get a leg cramp and they stop too long. Like, it was just a lot. And, thinking about the physical toll that this would take, I think is what really kind of got to me a little bit. And thinking about how these characters are trying to survive each other. The walk has no finish line. It goes as long as it goes, but the human body can only go so long. They are given water, they are given food every morning at 9, and they are allowed to relieve themselves, as I said, but they can only do it, without really stopping, or they get warnings. So during the course of the walk, it does have like heavy downpour. It was a lot, and it was very bleak, and the ending was also very sad. And it was definitely, like I said, it was a book that I never knew about and had seen it on a random list of shorter Stephen King novels, and I read it, and I'm glad I read it. But wow, it was definitely something different. If you're looking for something different from Stephen King, because this is written under a pseudonym, it does have a different type of a flow. I'd recommend this one. It's just as obviously beautifully written and descriptive, but it's bleak. And I had to sit with it after for a little bit and just kind of think about what I had just read, because wow, it was definitely a ride. The next Stephen King book on my list is Carrie, and I read the audiobook, which was read to me by Sissy Spacek, who played Carrie in the original adaptation in the 70s. And having seen the film so many times, I was very interested in how different or similar the book was going to be, and I was pleasantly surprised. The novel is very, very similar to the movie. There are some changes, of course. One of the biggest differences throughout the book is you get these tidbits of news articles, scientific journals, academic papers, stuff like that about what happened with the Carrie White case. And then you also get a bit more of the aftermath. So that was really cool to hear about Carrie's life when she was a child, but then also getting these scientific papers kind of describing the phenomena that she had and like the study cases that they did on this case. So it definitely had a very true crime aspect to it with all these other little tidbits, and I thought that was really cool. And what was interesting, having watched the film and watched Sissy Spacek's characterization of Carrie, the Carrie in the book is actually, she's overweight, she is pimply, she's like a completely different body type, which kind of makes sense in, types of kids that would be made fun of in school. But I wasn't upset by the fact that Carrie looked very different from obviously Sissy Spacek's Carrie, because Sissy Spacek's Carrie was very much super skinny, very plain. It still was a dynamic that worked, I think, in both formats. I can't say the same for the Chloe Grace Moretz version just because she's way too pretty to be Carrie, but that is a whole nother thing that we're not going to get into. But I really enjoyed this one. Like I said, it was very, very similar to the movie. I was actually kind of shocked by how similar, and the tragedy of it all was, still very apparent. I wouldn't even really consider this one really a horror novel. It's just a novel of an unfortunate kid that just had too much, and other people had to suffer the consequences of people basically being assholes for no reason. And it's a shame, but I definitely enjoyed this one a lot, and I'm glad I finally got to read it, considering I've been watching the movie for 2.5 decades at least. So yeah. The last Stephen King book that I read in October was The Institute. Again, my shame, I specifically picked this one. The premise sounded interesting, but on top of that, Santino Fontana did the audiobook, and we all know I have such a love for him, so I was very excited to have him read me the audiobook. But this one was really dark for different reasons than the other books that I read this month. This is definitely trigger warning for child abuse and child torture. This book is actually one of the newest Stephen King books on this list. It was only released in 2019, so it's very current. And it was very strange reading a Stephen King book that talked about Uber and the internet and stuff like that, because when you think of Stephen King, you do think a lot of like 70s, 80s, just because that's when a lot of his more famous works were written. But I enjoyed that aspect of it because I'm like, oh yeah, Stephen King still writes. He's been writing literally for decades and decades. He didn't just stop in the 80s, Heather. So this one follows two kind of storylines that end up converging. In the beginning part of the novel, it follows Tim, who leaves a job in Florida and is trying to get to New York City, and on a whim, he decides to take a buyout from an airline that had too many seats in the flight he was on and kind of hitch his way up to New York City. Tim was a former cop in Florida who had to resign due to issues that happened while he wasn't technically on the clock, and he basically just kind of wanted to start life anew. So he goes to the small little town in South Carolina and decides decides to take a simple job, take a simple room, and just kind of chill for a bit, and maybe in like a year or two keep making the trek up to New York City. Then we go into the main storyline, which follows Luke Ellis, who is a gifted individual who has a slight tendency for telekinesis. Nothing Carrie level with his abilities, just something slight. But he's a boy genius and he's trying to go to MIT, try to convince his parents of that. In the middle of the night, one night, he is kidnapped and taken to this institute in the deep woods of Maine that is full of other kids that he discovers have abilities as well. They either have telekinesis or telepathy, or in the case of him, labeled a pink, where he might have the ability to exhibit both telekinesis and telepathy, even though telepathy is something he has never experienced or done. But he wakes up in this room that looks like his room but isn't. It has no windows. Everything that's in his room is pretty much in the same place, except that there are a couple of things that are wrong. And he meets the other kids in this institute, most notably Kalisha, who has telepathic powers, and Nick, who is one of the only kids that is trying to fight back. And by fight back, I mean literally fight back, because the adults that work in the institute regularly will, as I said, torture children, and he has a lot of bumps and bruises because of this, but as kidnapped as they all were, and is trying to be as defiant as possible just to make it harder on their captors. The kids aren't sure why they were brought there, but the doctors and other people in the institute inject them with shots, ask them if they see dots, and put them through other different types of tests that could cause, side effects or not. It depends. But it's all in a way to heighten their abilities. A new child comes in a few days after Luke arrives, named Avery, who is an extremely, extremely powerful telepath. Kalisha, Nick, Luke, and Avery kind of form this like little friendship band together. But the problem is, after a certain amount of time, kids are moved from the main institute to the back half and essentially never seen again, because after the back half, then they're moved to the back half, which is basically where they all become drones. I'm not going to go into what a drone is because I suggest you read it, but it's not anything good. Even though the adults in the institute are constantly telling them that if they're good and they do what they need to do and do their job, they'll be sent back home to their family. With Avery and Kalisha's help, Luke is actually able to escape. And that's where his storyline converges with Tim, and Tim becomes essentially the only adult around that can possibly save him and his friends' lives. I'm not going to go into it much more, but this one was extremely dark. This one had lovely moments of friendship and found family love, but it's a lot because it is literally torturing children, and there's like a scene of waterboarding. Like, it's definitely not for the faint of heart, this one, and I recommend, if you're going to read this one, to go in with the right mindset of what you're going to read. But it's definitely one that I think would make a really, really cool series adaptation, a 1-season limited series type of thing, because it was really well done, and I think it could be done well on screen. And this one was a ride, and the thing is, at the end, there is this kind of what if everything that they did was actually for the greater good or not, and what was being done to Luke and his friends was for the greater good or not. So there is this weird kind of morality to it that is very gray, because obviously the people that control this are terrible human beings, but they had a point, and that's all I'll say. I don't want to spoil it. There was a reason that they were doing this, how awful it obviously is, and it's like you have to weigh these things, and that's what the characters end up doing at the end, is just kind of weighing the pros and cons of this morality game that they unfortunately became involved in, because it's impossible to know what was right and wrong and what was happening. I really enjoyed this one a lot. I enjoyed the kids' characterizations. I said this many times before. Stephen King can write kids very well. They're very realistic, even though, King is a very old man. This is one I recommend reading, especially if you're trying to find different Stephen King from his older, more famous works. Give this one a try. It was really good. It's pretty longish, but it was very enjoyable, and I felt went by really quick. I really enjoyed this one a lot, but definitely go into it with the right headspace for sure. The last book I read in October was The Turn of the Key by Ruth Ware. This one was on my TBR for a while as well, besides just the October TBR, just in my Goodreads TBR. I want to call it like tech gothic horror or something like that, because it was very much written in the vein and tone of classic gothic horror. So your Turn of the Screw, your Haunting of Hill House, Frankenstein, Wuthering Heights, very descriptive of the landscape and the house. It was really strange because it felt like one of these classic gothic horrors, but then and they're talking about like the apps they're using to turn on the lights. So it was this weird clash. The plot line is kind of similar to The Turn of the Screw, which this book follows Rowan, who is trying to make a new start and sees this too good to be true offer of a live-in au pair to this rich architectural family that live in Scotland. She ends up getting the job, which, as I said, is too good to be true. It's like 3 months off, 50 grand a year, insurance, everything else, and have this really plum job in this gorgeous estate called Heatherbrae. So she ends up getting the job, of course, and the morning that she heads up there, she's told by the parents when she gets there that they are leaving soon. They're leaving like that day to go to this conference, and that she's going to be left alone with the kids for at least a week. Kids that she's literally a stranger to. Obviously, she's taken aback and is kind of just left to basically be with these 3 young girls on her own in this big house and trying to build their trust and make sure to keep them, you know, safe and taken care of while the parents are gone. And of course, the girls don't make things easy for her. There's the baby Petra, the 5-year-old Ellie, and the 8-year-old Maddie. They also have a 14-year-old daughter named Rhiannon, who is currently away at school but does end up coming back. And Maddie absolutely despises Rowan for reasons that she's not understanding why, and just acts like a little brat, while Ellie likes Rowan but also is, you know, trying to do what her big sister wants her to do. So it's this kind of push and pull. Rowan's kind of only solace during this time and this just, you know, stressful situation is the handyman Jack, who lives on the grounds, and they start kind of developing a relationship. What's interesting is this novel is written while Rowan is currently in prison to, I believe, a barrister who she's trying to convince that she is innocent of the murder of one of these little girls. This was not a spoiler because you literally know this within the first like page of the novel. She's basically going through her entire experience to try to prove that she did not kill this little girl. There is 2 huge twists in this. I'm not going to go into any of them because I want you to be as shocked as I was when I read it. As I said, this is a true gothic horror, very similar to Turn of the Screw. There are some weird things that are occurring at night while she's there. She continues to hear walking back and forth in the attic above her bedroom and can't get any sleep. Things keep appearing or disappearing and she's not sure why. And she suspects, Maddie especially knows something is going on, but she also is wondering if she's just kind of losing her mind or if it's something actually paranormal, because she is the, I believe, 6th au pair to come in the last like year, because they all keep leaving mysteriously very quickly, some within like the first day of being there. So something's going on with the house. And the house itself is literally described as a fusion of Victorian and completely modern, just remixed and smashed together, because the entire house is controlled by a system called the H.A.P app that controls, you know, temperature, the coffee maker, the TV. There's cameras into the girls' rooms, into her room, and everything else. So everything is surveillanced and like state of the art, but then you're on these very grand countryside and stuff's acting weird and it's creepy and it's rainy, it's Scotland, all these like things that shouldn't go together that are going together in this book, and it's really well done. And like I said, the twists I was not expecting at all. You know, the first one happens and you're like, okay, so then you go through and then you realize what actually happens at the end and you're like, oh no, it's just it doesn't end happily, I will say that, and it leaves you very much wanting, much like The Turn of the Screw. So I can tell that this was modeled very much after that novella, but it was done in a very contemporary way, and this is a true contemporary gothic horror like I don't think I've really read before, and I highly suggest it. It was a really fun fall read, very cloudy, rainy day read for sure, very creepy read. I gave it a solid 4 stars because I really enjoyed it a lot. Whew, I'm sorry because that was a long video, but those were all of the books that I read in October. It was a month full of spooky reads, atmospheric reads. I really enjoyed this month. It was really great. I'm sad that it's over, but we have some really fun reads coming up. Check out my November TBR for what I shall be reading in November. Have you guys read any of these books? If you have, leave your comment down below. I'd love to discuss some of them, especially Turn of the Key, just because of the twists that were involved in that were pretty crazy. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I look forward to seeing you guys in my next video. Bye!